Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues. And I'm sorry that I joined a bit late, but I really had huge troubles to join, but I'm here and happy to go. First of all, a very big welcome to our speakers of this afternoon. And then, of course, also to our participants, which I can see is actually growing by the minute. We are very excited to have this webinar. This could be the beginning, actually, of a couple around this particular subject field. Just to give some background, we felt at the time, because the South African Journal of Science celebrated its 120 years, that it would be good if we could capitalize on what has already been said during the celebratory issue, which was published last year, because it seems that we can actually investigate and explore the history of science in South Africa over the years. So extremely grateful then to all our participants this afternoon to take the subject field forward. You will see that it is quite multidimensional in terms of the subject fields that it would deal with. And we welcome you then to please proceed. Linda, I wonder if you would like to take over from me and perhaps introduce our two main speakers as a start.
Okay, I wasn't sure that I was going to introduce them, so I'm very sorry. I just need to call up. I thought it was you, Susan. Do you have the bios there for at the moment, or I just need to call them up otherwise?
Sorry.
Susan, do you have the bios?
Yes, no, not in front of me. If you have them more readily available, I'm sorry about that. But in my panic to actually sign up to this meeting, it was quite a task.
Okay. Well, I will do my best. I apologize if I make a mistake, but I think it's important that we just get on with it. Our first speaker is going to be Professor Saul Dubow, and he's the Smuts Professor of Commonwealth History at the University of Cambridge, and a fellow of Magdalen College, Cambridge in the UK. And he is also the author, or the co-author, I should say, of a recent book called The Scientific Imagination of South Africa, which everyone should pick up a copy of and read. He will talk about the historical and thematic framing of South African science in global and national contexts. And I think I just want to hand over to you, Prof, and take us back in time, please.
Right. Hi. Thank you very much, Linda, and thank you very much for the invitation, Ina, and it's great to be here amongst colleagues and old friends. I'm not going to speak to the whole of my topic, I'm afraid, which I don't think it was quite my brief anyway, but I want to talk to an aspect of it arising out of a lot of work broadly in the history of science in South Africa, and to raise a broad question about connections, international, transnational connections, and perhaps to challenge what I think is an assumption, sometimes stated or unstated, that South Africa has lived in a kind of state of relative isolation, certainly for much of the historical period, from the colonial period till at least the end of apartheid. So I just want to make a few points, really much more interested in what people have to say in discussion. But I want to begin by drawing attention perhaps to two recent publications. This is in the last few months, both of which kind of bookend the talk. One is both by young scholars, Cape Town educated. One is Giovannetti Singh, who is doing a really outstanding piece of work going back into the 17th century and looking at something that really is only noted in the historical literature, and that is the astronomical mission, or the missionary mission of Jesuit Chinese who come past the Cape, establish what may have been the first observatory. It only lasts for a very short period, but also take a great interest in the near interior and in talking and interacting with Khoisan people in the Southern Cape. The other interesting piece that's just come out is by Jules Scottness-Brown, who has an article coming out of his own book with a wonderful title. That's the article, which he calls Gerbils Without Frontiers. And this is a study of the transmission of plague across boundaries. It's broadly in the early 1930s. And he's looking at the area from sort of the northern Namibia into Angola. And again, these gerbils become vectors, not just of plague, but of discussions between the South Africans and the Portuguese about how to deal with plague. So those are two recent examples where people are talking about unexpected connections. Now, I do think there is perhaps an assumption that South Africa sort of emerges into the global world or re-emerges into the global world of scientific interaction after a long period of apartheid isolation. And there is some truth to this narrative, of course, and ASSAf bears testimony to this. So does, for example, the history of the Square Kilometre Array, which on my reading tells a story of beating the scientific swords of late apartheid technopolitics into the plowshares for the new South Africa. Now, this, of course, extended much more widely than astronomy to government scientific policy and funding more generally, which included flagship research to the Antarctic and a range of other initiatives, often focused on South Africa's special advantages as a site of special scientific endeavour, and also levering that period of, let's say, global goodwill towards South Africa in the Madiba and Mbeki eras. So around 30 years since the formal end of apartheid, a full generation, I think we are in a position where certainly as historians, we're at a good moment to begin to assess how this momentum of integration or reintegration into world scientific networks have been sustained. My own sense is that South Africa was never as isolated as we might have led ourselves to believe. One point that occurs is that academic boycotts were far more in evidence in the humanities and in the social sciences, which of course were self-policing, than in the sciences, where interaction in universities, research institutes, and secret government projects remained extensive. It's also true that the apartheid government and the Afrikaner nationalist movement from the 1940s took interaction, scientific and technical interaction, very seriously. The technical development that began in the 1930s and is very much associated with the open Smutsian years, the Commonwealth and so forth, the foundation of the CSIR, actually extended far more, there's more continuity than many people realize, through Malung, who took a great interest for geopolitical reasons and political reasons in establishing a foothold of scientific and technical competence in Southern Africa and beyond, but also through Antarctic research, through mining engineering in fields like veterinary and agricultural science, the kind of sciences which seem to be technical, which are not quite associated with the civilizing mission, but are very, very much part of the Cold War science. And, the idea that South Africa was, if not a light unto nations, was certainly indispensable. There was also in this period quite a lot of evidence of a kind of intellectual import substitution. We see this very, very clearly, of course, in military initiatives, but also in other strategic efforts. And I don't know whether Patricia and Adrian will agree with me, but I think radio astronomy is a very good example. The story here begins with quite innovative scavenging around equipment taken from crashed airplanes during the war, and then extends to satellite tracking at Hartebeesthoek, in particular for the French and for NASA. This, of course, was disrupted by the withdrawal of American investment after the visits of Congressman Charles Diggs in the early 1970s. And so we also see a very strong indication of intellectual boycotts and withdrawal of goodwill. But we also see examples of continuing import substitution and adaptation. And there seems to me to be a clear line, a clear through line to the competences that are developed in radio astronomy, which then were then reconverted to civilian use and allowed South Africa to bid successfully for the SKA. A further point is looking at this kind of interaction and connections is to look at the individual rather than the institutional level. Personal biographies tell one a lot. Browse through Cornelis Plug's painstaking ongoing work on South African scientific biographies, and we see an astonishingly deep and storied set of evidence about interaction with many South African scientists born overseas, often maintaining a sense of dual identity, but sometimes deciding that they really are South Africans. The reverse is also true. As someone who enjoys reading newspaper obituaries, there are constant surprises. Oh, I didn't realize that so-and-so was born in South Africa and educated at, etc. It's also perhaps true, or an unremarked feature of the apartheid years is simply the amount of investment in science during the apartheid era. Not all of this was, of course, efficiently directed, and it certainly wasn't directed without very clear political aims. Much of it was about prestige, building up knowledge and institutions in order to equal and compete with English-dominated universities like WITS and UCT was a conspicuous feature of the 1960s and 70s, and extended as well into new and expanded universities like University of Johannesburg, Rau, UNISA, and Port Elizabeth. And that doesn't take account of the so-called Bantustan universities. We don't have to approve or endorse the assumptions underlying their creation to note that something was going on. There are micro-studies of, say, the Durban Medical School, of Westville, of UWC, which point to significant investment in science and technology. A prime example of unforeseen consequences, as historians often like to point to, were the Broederborn strategies that were subverted through the active agencies of talented scientists, or perhaps they weren't. In any case, we only have glimpses of what went on in the so-called Bush universities, colleges, and Bantustan universities in respect of science. We know quite a lot about social science, but I think this would make for an important study or studies. Finally, I think when we talk about connections, that invites us, in fact, compels us as well to look at disconnections, disruptions, and exclusion. I'm referring, of course, to the overwhelming evidence of how racism restricted and retarded Black scientific potential. We need to go further than this, though, which is always stated, but not always examined, and pose the question as to how segregation and apartheid used science to develop a sense of white power and prowess. We also perhaps need to distinguish between the Verwoerdian idea of mass education for Black secondary pupils and what actually happens in university education. It seems to me that we need to confront these questions again and again in serious ways and not simply to state them. The story is more ambiguous than we often take for granted. There's growing evidence, for example, extending back to the colonial era of counter-narratives, and I'm very glad that my co-author and colleague and friend William Beinart is here. The encounter between so-called Western science with indigenous or vernacular knowledge, especially in fields in the botanical and veterinary sciences, in conservation and in health and pharmaceuticals, is known to an extent. that record is patchy, but the light that's being shone by ongoing research makes the picture look much more dappled than it once was. There's a great deal more to be done here, and I would appeal to people, researchers, but also some of the people in this webinar to come forward with more examples. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. A lot of food for thought in there, and certainly something that I will go back and perhaps pick up your book and dip into it, because these are all very interesting points. We are going to move on to the second speaker of the two before we move to our roundtable discussion, and that is Professor Jane Carruthers, who is Emeritus Professor of History at the University of South Africa. And she will speak about the South African Journal of Science, or rather the trajectory of the history of science in South Africa, framed through the South African Journal of Science. I don't know how many of you read her paper or article in said publication on this very topic. And I'm sure you'll give us some choice insights from your paper and perhaps some extra bits. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Linda, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the seminar, and thank you to ASSAf for the invitation. Well, a year or so ago, I was invited to contribute a research article for the 120th celebratory volume of the South African Journal of Science. My brief was to focus on its long history as a leading South African science publication of more than a century standing. Now, for many decades, the journal was published by the South African Association for the Advancement of Science, or the S2A3. This was a non-governmental association of subscribing members from all walks of life, all disciplines, and all parts of the country. There were no restrictions on the race or color of members, but perhaps not surprisingly, given the period, there were no Black members, even from the medical and veterinary professions where Black scientists were represented. In the 1960s, the journal defended its open membership policy despite the absence of Black members, when instructed by the government to become racially exclusive, as were some other societies, and it refused to comply. Happily, over the past 30 years, the profile of the journal has altered substantially in this regard. Although much of the manuscript archives of the association no longer exists, many libraries hold hard copies of full runs of the journal, and many, but not all, of the issues have been digitized. With help from librarians, archivists, and colleagues, I was fascinated to leaf through every issue of the journal and to trawl through what archives are still to hand. With publication beginning in 1903 and still ongoing, it's hard to conceive of another source that documents so completely the many histories of Southern African science, as conceived in Western terms. It also gives insights into South Africa's scientific society, professionals, but also citizen scientists, and documents the questions they raised and the research that they accomplished. This is a long record of the priorities, the innovations, the concerns, the limitations, and the future potential of science, as seen by contemporary men and women interested in the topic. Over more than a century, the journal pages show how these altered with the decades. Importantly, too, it suggests a vibrant intellectual commons that included contributors, but also those involved in editing, managing, and production, as well as dissemination. Now, I could have approached this long history in a number of ways. I could have emphasized the important scholars, politicians, and thinkers, highlighting their contributions in particular. I could also have followed the disciplines, charting their growth or demise: biology, archaeology, astronomy, the environmental sciences, and many others that waxed, waned, or transformed over the decades. But with the title, the SAJS, a biography for my article, I decided to use the metaphor of a life to explore the journal as an actor, not only a vessel in science, since its first appearance in 1903 as the report of the South African Association for the Advancement of Science. This is a story not only of a scientific journal, but of how science, society, and publishing co-evolved over more than a century, transforming, growing, overcoming difficulties, coping with institutional changes, and importantly, meeting economic and political hurdles. It also involves those who ran the journal, managed it through its different life stages, and to those who continue to maintain it. And they are as deserving of our respect and gratitude as much as those who announced scientific breakthroughs in its pages. My approach then enabled me to consider the journal as a personality, as an actor in South Africa's history of science, and to explore and explain how it was enmeshed in science and society, and moreover, how it sought to establish a scientifically minded population. I'll begin at the beginning. After the South African War had ended in 1902 and before the establishment of the Union of South Africa in 1910, men from both the Cape Colony and what was the colony of the Transvaal then founded the S2A3 based on the British Association of the same name. At the time, there was only one university, the University of the Cape of Good Hope, an examining body, but scientists were active in university colleges, high schools, and in their personal capacities. There were disciplinary societies even then, and an academy, the Philosophical Society of South Africa, with a regular journal, the Transactions. But the S2A3 was to be different. Its aim was to bring people together, creating a forum for discussions and presentations, and to this end an annual meeting was convened in different parts of the region, open to everyone who wished to attend, often by the hundreds, whether scientists or not. Reaching out to the youth and to civil society, it also provided a scientific focus on the town or city in which this meeting was held. And this large conference was followed by a published report, often ranging into some many hundreds of pages, containing the papers that had been presented. One could say that the journal travelled with the annual meeting, held in various places, and thus reflected a geographically dispersed scientific community and focusing on the scientific importance or scientific resources of the venue of the annual meeting. Unlike an academy, such as the Royal Society of South Africa, the Akademie vir Wetenskap en Kunst, the Academy of Science of South Africa, or even specialist disciplinary societies, there were no barriers to membership. Its mission was inclusive, democratic, and collegial. In this early period, it served dual roles: one, as a venue for people with scientific interests, both amateurs and professionals, and two, as a way to communicate science more briefly to their peers and to the public through the report, which changed its name to the journal. It wasn't strictly original research only. There were lectures, meetings, and more general contributions. But over the 20th century, as science in South Africa became institutionalized with the growth of many universities, government departments, museums, research institutes, and so on, the journal became more formal. In the early years, it was edited and managed by unpaid volunteers. But with their growing institutional academic responsibilities, the journal had to be more professionally managed, taking account of editorial discipline, peer review, standardization, regularity of publication, and rigorous standards. The content shifted. Original research came to dominate, veering towards more technical and specialized material, and there were fewer popular science or general interest pieces. Then came changes in format, financing, name, publisher, and affiliation, reflecting broader changes in the scientific community and in national politics. The journal neared collapse in the 1970s, but was rescued through changes in financing and management, and particularly by the full-time professional editor who was appointed, Graham Baker, who stayed the course for some 36 years. This was a time when nature took over the journal for a couple of years, with the hope, as John Maddox said, who ran Nature, was the editor of Nature, that scientists in South Africa would labor more diligently to overthrow apartheid, act like a Trojan horse, as he said. In this, he later expressed his disappointment. The journal didn't exist then in isolation from its political or economic context, of course. Colonialism, segregation, apartheid, and state and economic priorities were what shaped who could be a scientist, what research got done, whose voices were heard, and where funding would come from. And in South Africa, access to education, institutional funding, etc., was deeply unequal. Power, privilege, and exclusion were intertwined with scientific success. So there were institutional changes. Initially, there was the role of the S2A3, and then later, when nature left the scene, involvement of bodies such as the Associated Scientific and Technical Societies of South Africa, the Foundation for Research and Development, and the government's own Bureau for Scientific Publications that determined which and how scholarly publication would be rewarded. But in the 1990s, as South Africa entered a new era, a different and more developmental agenda was promoted by the incoming government. And after nearly 40 years as the state-funded and supported academy, the Academy for Wetenskapskunst was dethroned and replaced by ASSAf, the Academy of Science of South Africa. The high profile of the journal, nurtured by Baker from the 1970s, made the SAJS a prize acquisition for the new academy, which became its owner and publisher in 2003. So the history of this journal reflects its shifting governance, its funding sources, and its alignment with national science policy. With financial support from the DSTI and the infrastructure of ASSAf, the journal has been able to prosper, reflecting the concerns of the state and of current South African society. Its mission includes not only original research, but also policy alignment, public engagement, and the inclusion of African relevant issues. In its approach and content, it continues the original mission to reach out not only to specialists, but also to non-specialists interested in science more generally. There are challenges. There always have been. Recent editorial reflections have highlighted evaluating submissions for novelty, importance, interest to wide readership, balancing disciplinary depth with accessibility, and maintaining rigorous peer review. The thorny question of how to incorporate non-Western or indigenous science and the growing power of machine learning or artificial intelligence has also got to be part of the future agenda. So in conclusion, I'd like to reflect on a couple of points for discussion. How can financial viability of science and science publications be maintained? The journal is funded by the DSTI. Does this contribute to its sustainability, or does it give us pause for thought? Can the issues of inclusion and equity be overcome in considering who writes, who reviews, and whose voices are published? Might compromises not have to be made? And in a journal like this, multidisciplinary and with a wide audience, how might the balance between presenting cutting-edge original research and societal relevance, public interest, and policy engagement be maintained? And another balance to be carefully weighed in our global world is that between global integration and local priorities. Navigating international publication norms, impact metrics, and so on could impact on the need to ensure that local African issues are central. And a couple of other matters that might merit discussion. How might the journal have been different had alternative institutional structures or policies been in place? For example, more early deliberate inclusion by way of non-racial science policies or more higher educational institutions. Would South African science have looked very different had those been the case? And how does the history of scientific publishing in South Africa compare with other former colonial countries? What's unique and what is common? One thinks of the division by language of the academic journals in South Africa, and indeed of the Academy versus the Royal Society, or the S2A3. And finally, the SAJS is not just a mirror of science in action in South Africa or a vehicle, but also an actor, as I've said. It has helped to define what science is, who gets to be a scientist, and how science in South Africa relates to society. This it continues to do. So it's more than a history of a publishing enterprise. It's a window into science in South Africa, showing us how science is not just about discoveries or research output, but about institutions, people, writing, communication, public engagement, power, inclusion, and change. And its history is not only a success of a long life. The journal's longevity has coincided with eras of exclusion in terms of who had access to science, who could publish, and who got recognition. but we must hold both the achievement and its limits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Carruthers. What a lightning story of 100 years of or more of scientific publishing in South Africa. We are now going to move to the roundtable section of this webinar. I first want to introduce myself. My name is Linda Nordling. I'm a science journalist. I write for Nature. I'm also the Africa editor of Research Professional News, which is a science policy magazine. And as a journalist, we're very concerned with the now. Hearing about the history of science always highlights, as the Prof just mentioned, that science is done by people, science is shaped by institutions. And so we have a very wide and august panel, and quite a large one. So I will ask everyone to keep their comments fairly succinct, but also I would like to invite everyone listening to this and who is not on my slate of speakers, please use the Q&A to highlight anything that you would like me to ask panelists, highlight questions that you have after hearing people speaking, so that we can make this a really interactive space. So in terms of the panel, we have astronomers, we have an economist, we have a feminist scholar, we have a water nanotechnologist, and we have a very august scientist who is very passionate about bees. So I wanted to start to ask Professor Robin Crew, Senior Research Fellow at the Center of the Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria, for some kind of bridge from this interesting these two presentations that we've just had into this with this roundtable. And in particular, I'm curious about your thought on the evolution of institutions in South Africa, and perhaps reflections on what influenced the institutions that we have today. And perhaps thinking about what the Prof just said about what might have been different if things had been a little bit otherwise. I'll give you the floor, Prof.
Thank you very much, Linda. And thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this webinar this afternoon. You'll be happy to hear I'm not going to say anything about bees, but I am going to pick up on two of the things that our introductory speakers have talked about, and that is the foundation of the South African Academy of Science, and also its foundation in a period of global goodwill, which was ushered in by the election of President Mandela. Now, what I want to do is to talk about the way in which ASSAf has benefited from that global goodwill, but it's predicated on a very interesting presidential address that George Ellis gave to the Royal Society of South Africa in 1994. And he introduced a number of things that have become critical to the development of science policy in South Africa. One of the ideas was of focusing on areas of scientific advantage. And I think that is particularly the case, for instance, in Antarctica, in astronomy, and in certain other fields. And what he also said at the time was that South Africa would become part of the global community. And he called for the formation of a National Academy of Science to represent the interests of science and to help formulate national policies. So there was a direct connection between the formation of a National Academy of Science and national policies. His notion was that we should make a conscious effort to build up and maintain the links, both overseas and in Africa, where there is now a possibility of building up so many links that it will become mutually beneficial. And he specifically raised the example of the African Academy of Science as an important link to develop. So, as we've heard, the Academy of Science of South Africa was established in 1996 and became a statutory body in 2001. And so that really fulfills the idea of having a National Academy of Science. Now, the new academy was distinguished from the two apartheid-era bodies, the Akademie vir Wetenskap en Kuns, and their statutory position was revoked in favor of the establishment of the new academy and the Royal Society of South Africa. And it was distinguished by having two interacting criteria for membership. One was scholarly excellence, and the second was service to society. And that was made explicit in its founding document. In addition, interestingly, individuals who were elected to the body were not called fellows for a number of obvious reasons. And calling people fellows, of course, is the practice for most academies of science internationally. But the new academy simply called those elected to it members, and hence the acronym MASSAF for the members. Now, once ASSAf had been recognized as the National Academy of Science for South Africa, the responsible department at that time, which was the Department of Arts, Culture, Science and Technology, commissioned a report from ASSAf to do a detailed analysis of South African scholarly publishing. And this ensured that the fledgling academy started to fulfill its role of providing advice to government and provided a source of income, of course, for the academy to establish that role. And at the time that ASSAf was coming to existence, there was also a heady time for academies of science globally. And we don't often appreciate that. And that was because the US National Academies of Science had a visionary president whose name was Bruce Alberts. And he was instrumental in driving the development of the international body called the Inter-Academy Panel, which was the global umbrella body for all national academies of science. So at the global level, the South African Academy rapidly became a member of both the Inter-Academy Panel, the grouping of all national academies of science globally, and was subsequently elected into the Inter-Academy Council, which was essentially its executive committee. And the representative from ASSAf was George Ellis as the first representative, who had shown his vision in his presidential address some years before. So at this time, the developed countries organized meetings of the G8 countries. They were G8 in those days. Of course, Russia was expelled from the G8 in 2014. But in those days, it was the G8 countries which met to discuss matters of common interest. And the academies of science of those countries also organized a G8 academies meeting to provide input into the deliberations of their parent countries. And interestingly, these academies driven by Bruce Alberts went further than their individual countries and organized the G8 plus 5 academies. And the plus 5 academies were Australia, Brazil, China, India, and South Africa. So in a sense, it was the BRICS plus Australia. And these meetings were held on each occasion that the G8 countries were meeting. And this gave the G5 countries, well, the G5 countries, academies, let's say, an opportunity to engage in the formulation of statements that would be presented to the G8 countries for consideration in their plenary sessions. The interaction in policy formulation and prolonged discussion entailed in reaching a consensus were illuminating for a nascent academy such as ASSAf, because we were significantly junior partners in this company. Alberts also was driven by his vision of inter-academy work to convince the Gates Foundation to fund a project through the US National Academies of Science to empower African academies of science to transform their roles from being almost exclusively honorific organizations to having a dual role of being honorific while at the same time producing evidence-informed advice for their governments and other constituencies. And as a consequence of these developments at the continental level, the network of African Academies of Science was formed in December 2001 as an independent forum for African Academies of Science to discuss scientific issues of common concern. There were 9 founding members at the time, and there are more than 50 members currently. Its establishment was initiated by the Inter-Academy Panel under the umbrella of the African Academy of Science, which had been founded some years before by Abdus Salam and headquarters in Nairobi. The South African Academy was a founder member of the new continental organization. The academies of science in Africa that participated in this activity benefited significantly from funding from the Gates Foundation and also from mentorship of the staff of the National Research Council of the US Academies of Science. And what that enabled ASSAf to do was to transform their secretariat into a well-functioning academy organization that was able to host a variety of activities. In addition, the engagement with the United States National Academy of Science led the Director General of the Department of Science and Technology of the time of making a parliamentary grant available to the Academy to support its activities, because his comment on observing this interaction between the US National Academies and ASSAf was that he did not want the South African Academy of Science to be funded by external donors. So as a result of these national endeavors, if we can call it that, ASSAf has been able to play a significant role in academy affairs, both at a continental and a global level. And this is perhaps best exemplified now by the fact that South Africans are currently presidents of the African Academy of Science, that's Professor Lisa Corsten, and the World Academy of Science, that's Professor Quraisha Abdul Karim. So I think that this goodwill dividend has allowed ASSAf to play a very prominent role in inter-academy activities on both a global and a continental level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think before we go to the astronomy section, I would like to hear a little bit from our Vice Chancellor, who is on this call. Prof. Tanjiwe Mayiwa is the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Mpumalanga. And I think you now have been in the role for maybe 2 weeks. I think when we spoke last week, it was 1 week. So hopefully things are going well there for you. I'm curious, you were on the panel, which we're not going to talk about so much, on a panel recently that evaluated South Africa's science policies for the science department. And obviously at the moment, the government is very keen, and funders, in order to get funding into science, we need to show that science is valuable to society. And it's interesting to hear from the earlier speakers that science and society were perhaps closer together at one point than they are now. And now we're trying to bring them together again. So Prof, oh, sorry, I managed to get some kind of weird thing going on. So Prof, would you maybe interject on, from your point of view, well, whatever you want to respond to the previous speakers on, obviously, but also looking at transformation in science, which is obviously a key thing in South Africa's science context at the moment. And what can we learn from history looking forward, and what is missing in this discussions about how we view science today?
Thank you. I hope you can hear me, Linda. Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and for the introductory speakers on this matter. I do concur with a number of historical trajectories that have been painted, that indeed they are actually demonstrating a fact that some people were left out. They were on the margins. And for me, before participating in this webinar, I had to be thinking about, in particular, ASSAf's role. And I looked at ASSAf's transformation strategy in particular. For me as a feminist scholar, as well as somebody who works on gender and indigenous knowledge systems, I found that it is not really a question of the history, but we need to be interrogating, appreciating, yes, indeed, the fact that science carries this proud legacy that's been quite well played out, as the previous presenters, my colleagues, have made reference to, but it is a very painful legacy as well. It is actually, we're proud because enormous world scientists that Professor Saul has made reference to, and of course the work that has been done, but there's pain, and the pain for me ahead of this webinar, I just had to talk to some people in terms of what's your perception of science? And for me as a feminist scholar, that's very important to get to the ground and talk to people and consult and check on what are missing pieces in this. That we, for instance, have quite a good policies set of such, and from the work that we did, being given that commission by the previous Minister of Science and Technology, that is Dr. Blade Nzimande, but the practice and the perception seems to be talking a different language here. And when I look at the language, I must say that, yes, we do have transformation frameworks, and looking at the October 2022 or thereabout, should I say 2022, ASSAf's insights in terms of the goals for demographic transformation, the public engagement, the importance of social science, impact is what the people that I had to consult in terms of what does research and science mean to you in essence. So for them, it is actually the few that I spoke to. Of course, I can't say it was a scientific study, but just leading to this webinar is the fact that it shouldn't just be transformation frameworks. It shouldn't just be equity targets. It shouldn't just be open science initiatives. It shouldn't just be a policy, but accessibility. Who's able to access the science that we produce? Who's being active in the science that we're conducting? So it is at two levels. Now, when I'm engaging what we've done in this trajectory that is so long, which is how accessible is it? And even the language, the technical jargon that may be used there, which makes science somehow receiving this perception of it is good for its sake, but does it solve the ordinary people's challenges that they have? Does it solve, for instance, and speaks to the structural inequalities? How does indigenous knowledge get to be mainstream or should be mainstream in the sciences? So that is my reflection at this point. And my thinking is that we need to be taking cognizant of that as well, which I appreciate that has been pointed earlier when my colleagues made reference to this, that there is and has been this unequal terrain, but we then need to be looking at how do we change that in a meaningful way so that we gain the trust, we get to involve, and then therefore have to say these missing pieces, looking at what, our chat that we had earlier, Linda, how do we get a girl in KZN, rural KZN, for instance, an emerging small-scale farmer or subsistence farmer in Mpumalanga, in Gamhlanga, where I was on Monday visiting them? How do we get them to see the outcomes of science, of research, until this science speaks to the world, until it speaks, until the journals that are very good and quite scientific and are celebrated and indeed are doing a good work? How do we bridge this excellence and make it to be relevant for a rural girl? For if I'm actually talking like this because being in Mpumalanga and having driven through, I see a lot of farms and it's beautiful, and I'm just wondering, aside the big ones that I see, what about the small ones that probably are not seen as you walk along or drive or walk along the highways, for instance? So for me, these are questions that I'm putting to the table to say, how do we bridge that and how do we respond, and what's ASSAf's role and responsibility for such? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think there is a lovely segue here to Prof. Patricia Whitelock, because this question of how do we get science to matter to society is something that has loomed large in astronomy, which is benefiting from a huge amount of money and investment in South Africa because of our geographical advantage, sure, but it has to show something for it. And so, Prof. Whitelock, I'm hoping that you will say something at least about how the astronomy community dealt with the outreach thing.
Yes, thank you very much. May I share my screen?
You may.
Thank you. I hope I'm doing that. Can you see my screen?
We can, but we don't have the, it's not in full screen mode. So you might want to put
No, I do. You're right. Let me do that. How about that? Yes,
perfect.
Lovely, thank you. And thank you for the invitation and the opportunity. Yeah, astronomy is particularly expensive, and it's, I think the community internationally is coming to terms with this question of how we need to justify what we're doing beyond the immediate benefits to scientists. And that's particularly true in astronomy, as astronomers have been very privileged with the vision of the post-apartheid government in terms of what science can do for development. And there are many things going on, but the thing I particularly want to mention is the IAU, International Astronomical Union Office of Astronomy for Development, which I think has really led the world in this. Astronomy is expensive anywhere in the world. It's expensive in the United States and Europe, and they are also exploring these kind of things. In 2011, the International Astronomical Union, in partnership with the South African National Research Foundation, jointly decided to fund an Office of Astronomy for Development. And let me emphasize, that's astronomy for development, not the development of astronomy. The idea is to impact on the development agenda. It's hosted at SAO, the South African Astronomical Observatory, in Cape Town, and its director currently and since its foundation is Kevin Govender. And in terms of what they do and what they've achieved, perhaps the fact that the IAU and Kevin Govender were jointly awarded the 2016 Edinburgh Medal, which is presented to those who have made a significant contribution to the well-being and the understanding of humanity through the sciences. Let me read the citation at the time, was for the creation and practical establishment of the Office of Astronomy for Development, which integrates the pursuit of scientific knowledge with social developments for and with those most in need. And it may be of interest to people to know that previous recipients of this medal include the Nobel laureate Peter Higgs and CERN, Sir David Attenborough, and Dame Jane Goodall. Govender was the first and, as far as I know, the only South African recipient of this honour. Let's try and go on. I obviously can't tell you in detail. If you're at all interested in this, I strongly recommend their website, which has a lot of detail of what they do and what they can do. But they've supported over 236 projects. Many of them are in Africa and in South Africa, but they've actually dealt with 112 countries, so they're worldwide. They've reached over 2 million people, and they have distributed funds exceeding 1.4 million euros. And they reckon they have impacted on 13 of the Sustainable Development Goals. So their activities have had positive outcomes on employment and livelihood, skills development, STEM education, and gender equality. So really across the board. And I think they have shown a new way in which science and society can impact, something that other sciences can learn from or work in partnership with. I mean, this is not astronomy on its own. It's often very much astronomy in partnership with other scientists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I am not going to go to the other astronomer on the call straight away because I want to switch things up a bit. I am actually going to throw Dr. Mondi in the deep end because we haven't discussed exactly what you want to make, what points you would like to make. But I'm curious about the views of an economist. At a stage in South Africa's history where science funding is hard to come by, funding in general is difficult to come by for everywhere. What are your reactions to the discussions that have been had so far in this conversation? I'm going to read out your I'm going to present you properly. Dr. Lumkile Mondi, who's a lecturer of School of Economics and Finance at the University of the Witwatersrand. What's the economist take on this enormous background of science, the evolution of science in South Africa, the evolution of South Africa around science, and what can we learn from economy or from economics?
Thanks again for inviting me. SMARTS is very instrumental in the formation of the CSIR to exploit the endowment that South Africa has, in this case, coal, and also the farsightedness around economic inclusion of a minority, in this case, the Afrikaner, into the mainstream of the economy, and extracting rents from the English-dominated mining sector through an SOE that we all know has become quite notorious for various reasons because of its impact on the South African economy, called Eskom. And the farsightedness of really using South African skills located globally, in the case of Hendrik van der Beek, and how that vision and the ability of creating a very strong, dynamic, nationalistic economy for empowerment of Afrikaners drive also that the only way out for inclusion is industrialization. Therefore, a link between mining as well as energy in the form of Eskom, but also steel in the formation of ISCO, today's ArcelorMittal, which become very, very, very important. But of course, with the endowment that we have in South Africa of coal, there laid an opportunity of creating also self-sufficiency in relation to liquid fuels, partly given South Africa's geographical position and the introduction of apartheid and the sanctions that came, particularly in the early 60s after Sharpeville. Those drive an ideal which Stephen Sparks talks more about it in relation to the to Sasol, and how the IDC plays a critical role as a source of finance, working with the state and private sector innovators to try and build self-sufficiency and invest in that technology that came from Germany called Fischer-Tropsch. But more importantly, so I'm jumping up and down. I know. So if you look into this, what Fine and Rastomje called a minerals and energy complex, science has been deep in it, both in the minerals, on the mineral side. Thomas Pogue has done a lot of work in relation to the innovation that science brought in the exploitation, in particular of the poor gold ore in the Witwatersrand, and how that knowledge was used to exploit coal, but more importantly also how that moved on to the liquids that Stephen Sparks talks to. But the point I want to make is that the ambition by Afrikaners, which Dubow in the Afrikaner nationalism that talks to, and people like Posel in the Apartheid Project, and people like Gabriela Hecht and Edwards, they talk about the Afrikaner nationalism being African and also Western. So that ideology of being Western pushed some of the discussion that we're having here in relation to globalization in the but in that period of South African scholars and science, because that Westernness, that idea that, you know what, we are African, yes, but we belong to the rest of the world in the Cold War sense, to Western, and how then science and technology is used, as Keith Breckenridge argues, in the biometric state. It is used firstly to document South Africans because we don't belong here, we belong to our homelands, and also for surveillance by biometric apartheid. So all these things I've mentioned, both from the minerals to energy, and also how in terms of defense, that all biometric, that energy is used in the energy and the space economy of South Africa. Firstly, through nuclearity in the form of Quebec, but more importantly, in the form of Armscor and Denel, where when in my later life now, in the post-apartheid, I become a director in one of the offspring of the minerals and of the military industrial complex of a company called ASSAf, which basically was developing technologies, which is being used now both in the war in the Middle East, but also partly in the war in Ukraine. The refueling of jet killers. These are jets that carrying bombs to maim, to kill innocent people in these different countries that you all are following in this period. So just to conclude, is that what we've seen in South Africa is that in the new order, there's been past dependence of the past. So nothing has changed in terms of the exploitation of the resources that we had, that were inherited by the democratic regime. More importantly, what is encouraging is that some of those continuities are becoming more and more innovative. For example, Professor Nikki Wagner and at UJ, as well as a colleague at Veds called Nandi Manumbazo, they're working on coal, on breaking down coal to extract rare earth minerals and critical minerals, which are critical for the future economy, which South Africa is playing a role, but it's dropped the ball because the new big thing in economics is the space economy. This is where we're going. We're seeing the bad part of it in the war around the use of drones. But more importantly, you see companies like SpaceX and others who are looking at other ways, of course, for commercial reason, because their leaders taken over what NASA and other governments have built, but to make it commercial. But I think there's space for South Africa now that as it moves away from this path-dependent economy, it starts carving out its new role, particularly in the space economy, because there lies a big opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I see we are, we've got 20 minutes left, and I'm hoping to get a little bit of a discussion going at the end. So let's move on. Dr. Adrian Tiplady is the Deputy Managing Director of Strategy and Partnerships at the South African Radio Astronomy Observatory. So it's back to astronomy. And I may have misremembered, but I think you might want to say something about impact and possibly about publishing. Is that correct?
Primarily about impact, but I can touch on those things as well. But I think, you know, what is really important to recognize these days is the need to have a social license to operate for research infrastructures. And what I mean by that is ensuring that we are seen to be legitimate investment of public resources. Which is one of the contributing factors that are pushing the need for research infrastructures to have recognizable impact. There's a very good example more recently of the TMT telescope, so it's an optical telescope to be located in Hawaii. The construction program was effectively shut down because of a lack of buy-in by local communities. And so something like the SKA project, I think, is very impact-driven. It certainly speaks to a developmental agenda. It speaks to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the entire conceptualization and design of the SKA project certainly is to ensure that we have a multi-sector, multi-segment value proposition, one that is delivering science to the scientific community, but is also able to deliver value to local communities as well. You can imagine building significantly large research infrastructures in remote rural areas, particularly in Southern Africa, where they may be socioeconomically depressed environments. And so we need to ensure that, as a critical success factor, ensuring that the local communities are seen as part of not only the construction but long-term operations of the facilities. And this is why you see a number of strategic interventions, both from the optical astronomy as well as radio astronomy side, with within South Africa to really ensure that we are delivering this value to the development of STEM within South Africa. And I think something like the SKA project starts to become a vehicle for science diplomacy, where we've seen the establishment of the SKA Observatory as an intergovernmental treaty organization. And I think this is certainly going to become more and more important as we get into the era of big science. I think the particle physicists have been in this game for a lot longer. If you read any scientific publication from CERN, for example, you've got to go through a number of pages to go through the authorship before you get to the science, right? And I think with the development of next generation astronomical facilities that need to be established in more remote locations than historically done, you'll probably begin to see this. And I think, that this kind of global interconnectedness, and this is really what is pushing this idea of a social license to operate, is the global interconnectedness. And one area where this global interconnectedness is also having an impact, I think, is in the adoption of open science in the open science ecosystem, which has subsequent implications on communities of practice around research publications and how we actually publicize our research out. So I think particularly if we start to see the advent of open access journals, etc., and how it starts to impact rating systems, for example. Where are we publishing? Are we publishing in Nature or in Astronomy and Astrophysics or Astrophysical Journal, etc., where we are being monitored against citation indices, etc. And so I think we are going to go through a transition period where the impact of one's research and research outputs is quantified and measured through a number of different metrics and lenses, not only through traditional publishing practices, but new altmetrics, for example. I think it will be a really interesting time, and we're going through this period of transition, and it will be exciting to see where we land.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, and I'm quite excited to hear from you actually, Prof. Feliswa Nomgongo. You are the DSI and RF Saatchi Chair for Nanotechnology for Water at the University of Johannesburg. And obviously, the Saatchi chairs are an interesting beast, right? We're talking about institutions, but there's also, science is also driven by mechanisms and funding mechanisms in particular. The Saatchi chair is obviously a huge flagship program for the South African science funders. And as someone who holds one, I'm really curious to understand, well, first of all, any reflections you want about the history of science and how we got here obviously is welcome. But how does the design of the Saatchi enable you or not to kind of move with the breakneck pace of development in science in terms of how you publish and how you communicate your research with the wider public?
Thank you very much, Linda. Good afternoon, everyone. My reflection is I see Saatchi first as a program that enables what I can call science for all. That's how I see it. It's different from how the other person would see it. But looking first, I think I link it when I listen to the history from the other presenters, and then I look back and like, oh, South Africa come from very far when it comes to science. So it means there is evolution. There has been evolving activities that takes science further. And then it shows that it has been, if somebody can draw a map, we'll see different landscape of science in South Africa. And SACHI, for me, I think is one of the initiatives that then helps one to build science build scientific ecosystem that is inclusive, that is also transformative, and that it's supposed, or it's responding to the societal need. Because when it's designed, it's a specific, it addresses a specific topic or a specific problem in South Africa. I'll make an example with mine, where I'm looking at nanotechnology for water. The question is, how can we use nanotechnology in our water problems in South Africa? Then what does it enable then? I need students. So it means I will be able to recruit more scientists. That's why I said inclusive. Inclusivity. So I'll recruit scientists from different local labs to come and work in this aspect of water, which is a very important aspect in terms of all of us, we need water. And it's also the transformative, because sometimes you see that certain areas, it's concentrated by either males or a certain race or things like that. But the more we work, the SACHI, you have mandate that you need to abide by. So you then think back and change how you do things, and look at your research group, for instance, and say, I think I have my research group is like it's one gender. Now you make it your mission that I need to recruit more people to do that. And it actually allows us to also look, not only looking at increasing a number of scientists, but also looking at what is a South African problem that I need to look into. Then in that way, we cannot say I'm solving a problem, but not talking to people on the ground. It then forces you to learn on how to communicate with the people that you think you are bringing a solution to. For instance, I deal with water quality, especially in the rural areas. Now, when you get there, when I talk about water quality, it's like, what is water quality? So I need to be able to engage with the society and sell the product that I'm selling to, and be able to sell what convince or talk to them and understand what is the problem that is there. But another thing that I see as SACHI enabling is that it's locally, but also it speaks to the global problem, because you have to meet with people that you talk about. It also increases your visibility as a researcher. But in all, I think for me, it's the fact that it's designed in such a way that it concentrates on a certain topic, a scientific topic. It then makes us to rethink on how we do things, and it can even help us to shape certain aspects in South Africa, whereby we don't look on one side, we also look at a holistic point of view in terms of looking at, if I can use water, look at water as a whole, not looking at, okay, I get water from the tap. There are people who don't get water from the tap. What is the solution for them? So it makes us to think on how can we assist in solving the problems that we have in South Africa. And also when training the students, it really assists in terms of not only the technical skills, but also going back and how do they engage in their respective communities? What is it that they could do to help with the skills that they have to assist our society when we have the problems? And when I said, for me, it's a science for all, it's because it actually makes a good platform where you can be able to connect with the public, and it supports quite a number of initiatives. It's not just a funding. Sometimes you might like, okay, it's a funding instrument, but it makes you think, this is not just funding, but you get this funding. What difference are you going to make in our society? And that for me, I would say the SACHI program, I'm grateful for it, because it is really, and I think it's still going to continue helping South Africa scientific community in South Africa to evolve. And it's going to help us to contribute to the solutions to the problems that we have in the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And in the usual way of these things, I have gotten exactly halfway where I wanted to be at this point. I see we have another 8 minutes. And I think Susan wants a little bit of time at the end to sum up. But I would like, at the very least, to return to our first speaker, Prof. Dubow. Obviously, we've kind of gone around the houses now and heard from a number of people who are in one way or another involved in South Africa's science community. All of us will be part of history one day. That's just the way it is. From you, what are the takeaways of what you've heard so far? And what does it say to you about where maybe the South African Journal of Science should look to sort of develop, in which direction, or ASSAf? Do you have any takeaways?
I mean, I have lots of takeaways. I'm not a great future gazer. I'm a historian. But one of the things I found myself thinking about was that thinking about the Journal of South African Journal of Science, I mean, Jane will be able to give me probably a more precise view, but it seems that so much of the output of the journal was written and contributed by individuals, and not always individuals who are in universities. To me, one of the greatest and least known South African scientists was Alex du Toit, who never had a university position, who figured out the importance of continental drift and South Africa's place in Gondwana in the 1920s, who found little support from many of his geologist colleagues in South Africa, and who died in 1948. And yet who managed to correspond, almost had no government, in fact, had no government support. He was a jobbing geologist and maintained an astonishing correspondence with people from all around the world, from Latin America, India, Australia, and so forth. So I don't think we can get back to that kind of position of the lone genius, and that's not what I would claim. But I think we can learn something about doing small scale, I mean, in his case, very large scale science, but it was thinking science, the capacity to communicate, to write in a very concise way, to lever and utilize what Robin was talking about, going back to that 1996 document, South Africa's unique place, and its its position on the southern continent of Africa, to really develop insights and to learn to communicate. So I certainly understand that we can't go back, we can't rewrite the history of big science, but it does seem to me somewhat paradoxical that South Africa was in some ways best placed to contribute to global science when it wasn't reliant on massive funding. Now, there are exceptions, and the SKA is one of those exceptions. But I do think it might pay to think about how individuals or small groups communicate, how they think about the significance of their writing, rather than rely entirely on an increasingly specialized large science, which South Africa finds more and more difficult to sustain for financial reasons alone.
Some really thought-worthy points there. Prof. Carruthers, do you want to add something, seeing as you're the furthest away from having spoken? Any takeaways from the later speakers in particular? Okay, in that case, I'm going to offer up the word. Oh, have we got it?
Yeah,
sorry, I didn't. I was. I hadn't switched my thing. I agree with Saul that we must think small, and that is exactly how the SKA's developmental role is to work. In other words, it's a person-to-person thing, as is the nanotechnology for water. And it was also, raised about women farmers who don't think big all the time. We don't have to be a global player all the time and everywhere. There are other ways we can be more effective in giving people knowledge, and actually we've just been talking about it obliquely, but also giving them power. So I think that would be my brief conclusion.
Wonderful. Does any of the other speakers want to interject? I think the hand-raising mechanism is working. Otherwise, Susan, are we running out of time? I think we are.
Yes, I think we are. But, Linda, I wonder if there's not perhaps somebody that has sort of a last remark. I would grant that opportunity and cut my own things into a minute or so. I'd rather that our speakers perhaps, just have a last opportunity to express their minds. Thank you.
Perfect. If people aren't putting their hands up. Oh, sorry, I muted myself. Who's talking? Adrian.
I'm happy to put my hand up. I think
Yes.
as just a last remark, I think in many areas, I think South African science certainly punches above its weight. The beginnings of the SKA project in South Africa, one of the things that we really had to confront was the perceived Afro-pessimism, right? That and I say this tongue in cheek, right? But a country, the southern tip of Africa, how could they possibly, not only just host a next generation astronomical facility, but actively participate in the detailed design, construction, and scientific exploitation of that. And we've done it by hook and by crook, by going out, understanding what the world knew and understood about building radio astronomy facilities, and then setting ourselves a task of doing it better, and using all of the knowledge and prowess and competency we've had within South Africa. We've been able to do that, and I think it's really a good lesson to learn, and really a nice takeaway, that South African science is had some remarkable achievements over the last 100 years, and I expect it to produce many more over the coming decades.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? Prof. Whitelock, do you have a last point that you want to make?
I don't think I want to add anything. Thank you for the opportunity anyway.
Thank you. Prof. Mayiwa, do you have what do you think about this idea of going small?
Yes, I mean, we could go small, but one thing that I think because of the time, that we haven't spoken about are the challenges to science, and in particular that are brought about due to the inequalities across the board. I mean, while we have to be celebrating the extraordinary achievements like the SKA, I mean, we've developed vaccines with biodiversity, water science, and all of that, but we have shrinking budgets. We have unstable governments. I mean, looking at the Madlanga Commission SOPI that we're having right now, should I call it that? And there's this mounting also pressure around student funding, which has led to the instability that we have seen, in particular in the two universities just in the past few days. So for me, these constraints for us as scientists and science, it should be in the context of all that we're doing that is good. How do we also say we have to shape how public perceives universities and perceives science, and when people see universities in crisis, in particular these two past weeks, for instance, we hear of struggling, much as we have the likes of such a chair, my colleague there, that get funding, but truth be told, there'll never be enough funding. But indeed, we seem to be, as a country, somehow treating science as some luxury that we can play around with. But for me, it's that science is not just luxury. It should be the engine that addresses indeed what we've spoken about in this roundtable, and that we need to fund it better than we're doing instead of seeing the dwindling funding systems. And indeed, I very much appreciate the mentoring that exists and all of that. But in the mentoring, we mentor our students, our emerging scientists to go where, to do what. So we're seeing a little bit less of innovation despite these groundbreaking scientists, at least from where I'm sitting. That's what I'm seeing, that we need to be also saying, let's just take science very, very seriously, just like we did when we were all afraid of one enemy, that was COVID. I mean, that's the only time that science got a face that was a good face. But thereafter, we've forgotten that science exists. And for me, I'm mourning that. Thanks, Linda and colleagues.
Thank you so much. I will offer one last chance for people who would like to say something at the end. Prof. Namgongo, Dr. Mondi. So otherwise, I think, Susan, I think it's time to wrap up.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, Prof. Crew.
Sorry, can I just make one comment?
Oh, Crew.
I need to make two comments, actually, very quick ones. One is there's a very interesting question in the Q&A from Dave Walwyn about where the deficiency in translation lies. And I think that's something that is worth exploring in greater detail. The second is a political failure. Our previous Minister of Science and Technology, Minister Naledi Pandor, had the vision of investing 2% of GDP in science and technology. And it's actually fallen significantly from a high of about 0.9% down to below 0.6%. And that underlies Professor Maiwa's question about the political commitment to supporting the scientific enterprise in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. So colleagues, please allow me, now that I cool, calm and collect, is that I do want to apologize for sort of me falling into this particular webinar and so unprofessionally sort of introduced Professor Dubow, Carruthers, and of course Linda Nordling. I do apologize profusely, but I really had the most bizarre moment with my computer, which I've never experienced before. But be as it may, and I hope you accept my apology, is that, colleagues, I'm quite sure that you will agree that we have managed actually to highlight quite a couple of issues. And also just to stress, that this whole feeling of ours, we always say sometimes we're here at the tip of Africa. And thank you very much to the speakers to have reminded us that this isolation is actually a self-inflicted one. And that by all these historical examples, etc., is that it shows us that we have actually developed far broader and far wider than what we thought. And it is true that our scientific system has actually matured. We are playing quite an international role and making some significant contributions in the world out there. But what was also quite interesting for me this afternoon, particularly, is that we started to sort of address the economic side of things. I found that was quite fascinating, is to listen to that. And then, of course, the SARSI chairs, as we know, there are a couple of discussions around the SARSI chairs. But again, this was proof and evidence that how important these SARSI chairs are to take us forward as such. And then, of course, what I also, especially in the field where I am, is research infrastructures, the importance thereof, moving over to big data, and then looking at how are we going to measure impact. That's a fascinating field, specifically if you look internationally, how there are attempts being made to measure research and the impact it has on very different ways and means. So I want to thank really Professor Dubow and Carruthers who have assisted us in putting this webinar together. Thank you, colleagues. I think we really managed to get something very interesting and very different. We have also received some criticism that why are we not paying attention to this or that? But I think you two have really managed us to shape our ideas, to also think a little bit differently, and then to start also thinking about what are the challenges that we are facing and the inequalities and that still exist despite all our efforts in research, and how do we take this forward? And then, of course, the very last critical issue that was mentioned is the whole funding and where will that take us. But colleagues, we're listening, and thank you very much for your input and also the questions that we had in the chat box. I think we will go back to the drawing desk and see what else is it that we can do with this, because it seems to me this is certainly a discussion that has not come to its end, and we have not explored or unpacked any of the very, very important issues that have been raised this afternoon. So certainly we will take it back home and we will discuss some more on this particular subject. I want to thank really our speakers and for your patience with my absolutely unprofessionalism today. But I tell you, a curveball was thrown to me, and I promise to figure out what this curveball was, and I'm still not sure what actually happened to me and my dear laptop. But colleagues, thank you very much, and to the my colleague that have organized it, Ina, with your tedious work at the back end of all, and of course Linda for your excellent chairpersonship this afternoon and your questions that you've asked. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a lovely evening. Thank you.